Hello and welcome to Galactic Goddess Podcast. I'm your host, Radhaa Nilia, and today we have a very special guest, Larry and Karen. And we're going to be talking about the path of enlightenment, reincarnation, and so many more things, but welcome.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation. I'm really happy to present one of my old and dear friends, Larry. And I think it's going to be a real treat for people. They get to hear stuff. So if they've got any really cool questions or comments or want to get contacted, just leave something at the end of the video. But I'm Karen Ann Lucyk MacDonald. I'm also the 13th White Bear tribal clan mother. So I think people, if they need to get a hold of me, they can check out my sites. I'm all over. Larry?
Well, I'm Larry, and I'm going to speak mostly about my past life at about 1500 BC when I was the prophet Moses. So that would be a little bit unusual for your ears, but it's just the beginning because there's wonderful documentation on it, and everything has been covered up, obviously, but what we have is the Bible that documents. The first 5 books of the Bible are called the books of Moses. And in a way, the Bible has been very misleading, but it is very accurate too. There's very little, that's sufficient documentation for any story. And there can't be any, there's a little bit. There are Egyptian records too.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mormons have something, but they don't let it out, so.
The Pearl of Great Price, right?
Yes, it's the Pearl of Great Price, but you won't find it online.
The other books of Moses.
If you're friendly with Mormon, they might show it to you.
So how did you come about discovering the concept of past lives, and what happened for you? Were you awakened to your past life?
Yes, that's a very good question. It came from way back, I'd say around 1969 or no, 1970, when I left New York, went to England. And in New York, there was quite an active New Age and all kinds of things to study and read. In England, everybody liked Rudolf Steiner.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of groups that met. So that I opened up to that, and I lived near Oxford, where he had spoken for 2 weeks in 1922. And I met people that knew people who had heard it. They told me a lot of things about what was genuine. So I studied for years. And one of the things Rudolf Steiner, he wrote often about Moses. One of the things he said was, in the end, Moses was not permitted to reach the promised land because he thought he was talking to God. He was talking to Jehovah. And Jehovah was in the service of what is called the Ek Masters. And the Ek Masters are in the service of the Ek, which is known as the Holy Spirit. So when you think about what God is, he creates the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit can act. But then how can the Holy Spirit act? It has to have people that will act for it. And the highest branch of people are these Ek Masters. There are a lot of masters, and they're fairly independent. But when you come back to it, the ultimate one is the Ek Master, and there's only one at a time on Earth. So it's a very clear, no chain of command is needed. There's the Master on Earth, and those who respond. And I suppose most of the audience here are selected, if not all of you, to having made a decision before birth to be a part of a project that will rescue humanity, which is what Moses did first time around. And he did it because he was able to alter human DNA in a very unusual way. But one of the first things you have to know about Moses, if you look it up, well, I'd say he lived 120 years. That's longer than I plan to live. And they say he was born in Egypt, which is not quite true. He was born in a different Egypt from the Egypt in North Africa. And the Egyptians were a very powerful country and the most famous ancient country with the most beautiful monuments and the largest. These Egyptians didn't have, in any sense, the economy to support that. They were getting the money from somewhere else. So they were in the trade, and the trade was human DNA, which was sold ultimately to alien races. And the alien race that liked the human DNA most was the reptoid race. So these are where the battle lines have been drawn until now. I'll leave out the very interesting question: what is AI going to do with all of the existing present power structure? Leave that out, because when we see the plan of the Eckmasters, all of it's covered, and it's very thrilling. Going back to Moses, if he wasn't born in the Egypt you know, why does the Bible say he was born in Egypt? Why does the Bible say he was put in the river in a basket while the other Hebrew boys of his age were put in the river to drown? But his mother somehow got him into a basket. Well, what river is it? Not in Egypt. And his mother wasn't born in Egypt. So if you go back to where the other country is, you have to ask yourself, what colony would Egypt have somewhere that would make her rich and impress the whole world with its great importance? 3 separate kingdoms from 3000 BC, roughly to 2000, then a gap, and then another kingdom. And finally, the last kingdom, which Moses had already fulfilled his mission, and they're not important to my story. So as Moses, I was born not in Egypt, but a country that Egyptians could reach by ships. And until the Egyptians had ships, the good-sized ones, the process of stealing human DNA was very difficult. But once the Egyptians were enlisted to be the slave masters and get things done, everything went well. The Egyptians, in a way, sold out. In a way, they had no choice. Well, what we don't know, which is so interesting, about 3000 BC, is what went on in Africa and South America. Why is South America the forgotten place in all that time? We say, oh, look, here are the Inca pyramids, here are the Aztec pyramids, and here are the Mayan pyramids. What made them build pyramids? And why pyramids? There's a definite hint of Egypt when you get into this Central America, the Mayans, and South America, the Incas, and then much later, the Aztecs in Mexico. So the answer is, that's where the Egyptians had their colony. That's where Moses was born. And the question is, how did he get there? Isn't he supposed to be in Israel? Isn't he supposed to be in the Middle East? Isn't that the Egypt that he was born in? Well, I'm afraid it's not. He was born in Central America, in the nation that's now Guatemala, in the major Egyptian city where the Hebrews were slaves. And they had to build a city for the Pharaoh that lived in that city. Now, I'm coming to the evidence, but let me give you the shock stuff first.
Okay.
There were large ships, and until they were large enough and could cover the ocean, the whole manufacture of DNA and export to Earth-alien races wasn't possible. And that shows us, I think, that there is some kind of cosmic agency, and until you get some level of consent, some nation like Egypt, that be involved, the aliens couldn't do it. Now that really is the prime directive. and it's in, of course, all the Star Trek movies. So they are highly channeled movies too. There's no question Gene Roddenberry, who wrote it, could receive knowledge. And the question of what source is, well, I keep repeating to you, the source is an ex-master. It has to be, because this isn't scattered knowledge. It's always the same. The same thing for Lucas with the Star Wars. There's very accurate information there. It's not quite at the level of Star Trek, but it's very interesting, because it's about, well, here's a sign. Be very careful here. There are no reptiles really in Star Wars. He's hands off. But all of the problem Klingons and the rest, many of them, if not all, are reptilian. So Star Trek could do it, but later on, as people got more alert, and then, of course, things are buried by being hidden in plain sight. There was a long series called V, the Visitors, and they were all reptilians. And I don't know how it ended for humans, but I'm happy to say this could end very nicely for us, and put an end to a lot of problems that we've been having over the last, say, 13,000 years, or even before. So those movies told us that there's a prime directive, and that prime directive must actually be enforced, because until Egypt was strong enough to be a real participant, which happened in 3000 BC, Egypt had three very important pharaohs that allowed all of these phenomena to occur. They were all female.
Clan mothers.
Well, that's right, clan mothers like Lady. And
All pharaohs?
Sir? It couldn't be otherwise.
Clan mothers have the power over the church and the state, or the land and the sea, actually. Whether it's the Lodial title.
I cannot name the first one because nobody knows her. And I can name the third, it's Cleopatra.
That's okay.
But the middle one is very interesting. And her name was Hatshepsut. So right now we could show her palace. And it's a mausoleum because the information she would give was too dangerous. But she carved it on the walls all over the palace. And that was the middle between 3000 and our present era. So it was in 1500 BC that Hatshepsut came to power and was a female pharaoh. The three independent ones only. There may have been one or two others, but they were the wives, dependent on their husbands for authority. Hatshepsut really had decided to let this information out, but not risk her own life. So she put it in her death palace, which is quite an amazing building. You've seen it now, I've showed it. And this story came out in 2009, that she had sent an expedition to a place called Punt, P-U-N-T, and the expedition was very successful and came back with great riches. And of course, that had been going on all along, 500 years, since the Egyptians got strong enough to be able to take the choice DNA of reptilians, which was black African DNA, and follow the ocean currents so that within a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe two, they could get black Africans over to South America, where they were farmed and, of course, killed, and the DNA exported. I'll take a little rest here.
We could also, I'm not sure if you can screen share. Are we gonna screen share some of those photos that we sent over? Is that a possibility, or we could leave it for two?
I'll have to, I have a, let me see if I can pull it up. But this is, yeah, I mean, just talking about Egypt, I guess my question would be, is that how the pyramids came about, or the pyramids came after the trade, the DNA trades, right?
Yeah, that's
So,
the question, but you didn't look, you couldn't study the pictures I sent you. I guess it was a little bit mixed up with the writing. Did you look at them?
yeah, I'm trying to see if I can pull them up. I haven't screen shared before, so it's gonna be.
Okay, here, well, you can do it later. The question is, Karen and I send them individually? There's about 15 important pictures. Or
Or if you make
can you
me host, I
extract it?
can maybe extract them.
Or you
Yeah.
can extract it out of that text and then make them bigger and make them
Okay, you're
describe them.
Karen.
Okay. So one of the things too, just to put things into perspective, a lot of people, this is sometimes new information, or we started talking about the book with Elena Danan or different things, with Ishmael Perez, or a lot of stuff that I received information from Sergeant Patty Broussard through what we did at Project Ascension. So there's a lot of stuff into the backing of this, but not everyone has that. So these are some of the things that people can look at for references. And Larry had a very extensive background. And that background is when he started, he had a walk-in experience when you were, I believe, 17. But, you grew up in Manhattan, in New York, and also was actually a lawyer, a Manhattan lawyer, and, graduated from law school and stuff. So a lot of this stuff is, how people form even their backgrounds. And what we're seeing with the DNA, whether we call it adrenochrome or we, call it like what's happened with trying to get PCR tests, trying to get that DNA. I mean, it hasn't stopped, has it? So we're looking at some of that here. So I'm just going to take a look and just see if I can dig up some of those photos in case I didn't put it somewhere else. But what were you thinking when you kind of went through some of those photos? What sort of came to you? I thought it was very interesting to see things about the Nile and some of the, again, trading. We call it DNA or trafficking right now. I think it's very relevant because what happens then is what's happening now.
It just hasn't stopped. It's a continuum of the past is where we are now, as you said earlier, and the enslavement of humanity through our genetics, and how do we get out of that? How do we reclaim our sovereignty? How do we claim our I hear it. Our DNA back for ourselves? Like, how do we clean house so that we can reclaim, how do we reclaim ourselves? It's so interesting because you're talking about past lives, and I have past lives of being in that time and being part of that.
You do.
Yeah, part of those conversations that were changing the whole trajectory. And
So that one, yeah.
Yeah, we're just going to bring up the photos here in just a second.
so,
We're
and so
able,
I think a lot of the star seeds and a lot of the people that are here to be part of this are to sort of bring balance back from past experiences, past agreements and such, right?
well, I got one of the pictures for you, Larry, on the screen. You want to talk us through this a little bit, please?
Well, yes. This will show you when the Egyptians had large enough ships to get over there to South America. They first, what do I say here, picked up Africans at Ivory Coast near Ghana and shipped to South America. Well, they had to get their ships there. And it's fairly well known that they made a round trip by going around Africa on that red arrow called the Aquinas Current, which meant they came out of the Red Sea. And nobody at any time, no other race that lived on the whites had been pushed into this Mediterranean Europe basin so that this operation would take place with the black. around Africa, you can see it went down the red arrow, but these were solid ships with many crewmen rowing. So they could get around there without a current. And I think they would make easily 200 kilometers a day, if not 220. The current, you can get 5 kilometers, which is 5 per hour, which is 100, 120 in a day, because the coastal currents are quite powerful. And you'll see that, and most people know the Gulf Stream 3 miles an hour, and that's how they got back. First, they had to go around Africa and up to the Ivory Coast, and that's roughly where the arrow shows.
Okay.
That was their main place to pick up the slaves, which they would then imprison and take over to South America. Now, this is quite a shock, this picture. We see the reptilian control of humanity here through the crocodile goddess Sabki of Egypt. Sabki became the dominant goddess of Egypt, dating through probably 2,500 years, even into the Roman period, the Greek period, when Egypt, after Cleopatra, 500 years into the AD, Sabki was the chief god of Egypt. And so somehow the reptilians in our evolution installed the hindbrain, which was a reptilian brain. And if you go back to the picture of Sabki, these children, these embryos, these are human embryos, a male and female, can't tell which is which. It doesn't matter. They're going to breed, they're going to have that reptilian brain, and they're sitting on it, the same picture as the medulla oblongata. She's not keeping any secrets. So the goddess Sabki is the leader of all of these reptilians because she controls the DNA. And the forces of light have a big problem because there are many galactic groups that need this DNA, human DNA. So they will fight for it. And so the people of light, the Ekmasters and others, have to devise a method where they can remove the human DNA without the galactics knowing it, galactic reptilians knowing it, or anyone knowing it. It's just a total secret. There's no better group to guard a secret than the Ekmasters. Then, so that they use, eventually they use Abraham, and Abraham is the one, the father of all Jews, who went to South America. The Bible doesn't really hide that, but it certainly won't say it. Okay, here's a picture showing that a smaller boat, I think 40 feet, was able to cross, this reed boat was able to cross the Atlantic from Morocco to Barbados, 6,100 kilometers in less than 3 months. And that was a much smaller boat because the nobody rowing and the waterline length of the boat was very short. So it has less ability to sail. Oh, well, now here's Moses, and Michelangelo has decided to paint me with horns. And of course, people ask him, they don't like it. But so it's put in a small church in Rome, a little out of the way, called St. John Lateran. But when I went to see it, I was quite surprised. Little did I know, but I wanted to see it. It's a Michelangelo. People asked Michelangelo, said, well, the stone required it to be cut that way. I don't think so. Michelangelo knew what Moses was capable of, and he was capable of communicating with Jehovah. And Jehovah, he thought was God, or he insisted was God, because that gave Moses the power over the Hebrews to pay attention.
Right.
So he's the first one to introduce them to Jehovah. Before that, they had a rough idea from Abraham, who was also instructed by Jehovah, instructed how to get to South America. And the Bible is fair about it. they say first he went to Canaan. Canaan is in Palestine. Canaan is 4 countries on the Mediterranean. It's Israel, and it's Lebanon, and it's Syria, and it's Jordan. Those, but God carved out a certain piece for Abraham and told him, yes, you can have this part and your descendants. But God never said, and the Bible never said, but not for 1700 years or 1500 years until you've done this mission in South America. Then Abraham went across the Negev desert. Abraham is the first book of the books of Moses. Moses isn't in the first book. The first book is called Genesis. And Genesis has a double meaning. Genesis can be DNA, or it can be, oh, this is the beginning of my story. In this case, it has both meanings, but it's a code word, Genesis. Why is that chosen? Now you know. Now you know what I think. So in Genesis, it explains that suddenly Abraham is commissioned to go and visit Pharaoh. This is the one in the Egypt that we know in Africa. He crosses the desert, visits Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, I need your army for something. Abraham was a soldier of fortune, like his father named Terah. So they were welcome everywhere because they fought for the whatever side hired them, but they brought the peace, and they used to win very quickly with a small force of a few hundred committed, able warriors. Then Pharaoh hired Abraham for something, and then somehow they agreed, Abraham, get on our boat. We're going to take you over to the new world, the other Egypts, and take everybody with you. There's a Pharaoh there who needs you, who's got a little trouble with different tribes. So now all the tribes are named and the battles, and Abraham generally wins them quickly. And then later, Moses comes along 400 years later, and he's got to fight these same tribes, but with a different purpose. The DNA of Abraham is a special DNA, and it's designed to prevent its use by alien reptiles. There's a lethal component to it. So they'll very quickly discover this is not for us. But they can't, and all this action has to be given very quickly before they discover it, and Moses is stopped. So there's one battle after another for Moses, 20 years. And one of the first things he does is go to Africa and destroy the slave capturers there at the Ivory Coast. Moses is not a sailor, and neither were the Egyptians, but the Greeks were. So you'll find a couple of things in Central America, in Africa, in South America, which are Mount Sinai and the port where they could commandeer and steal the boats to take Moses' army, which was a very big army, because it was the army of the Exodus. So he had all the Jews, and they'd been in Central America for 400 years. There was a lot of them. And the Egyptians became afraid and put them in the prison camp and made them work, but only the men. The Bible says, Pharaoh said, leave the women at home. We don't want to have all that trouble on our hands. Just the men, bring them here. And then the Bible says, by the time Moses had crossed the Red Sea, they left the women behind, or most of them. It doesn't say that, but if you read it, it says the Hebrew people, the people of Israel. But they cover the march to Mount Sinai in 90 days. That march, if you look at South America, for them to get over to the coast from Central America is 4,000 kilometers. So they couldn't have baggage. The Bible makes it very clear they carried no baggage. There were a few women Moses had a brother named Aaron, his wife. They got a few women out, so they helped a little bit. But the families had remained either where Pharaoh left them or on the other side of where they crossed the Red Sea. So there were many Jewish communities there at that time. The men accompanied Moses and they covered this immense distance, 3,000 miles in 90 days on foot. How did they do it? Because they were able to walk day and night, because they received manna from heaven to eat. So they didn't have to carry a kitchen. They only had to take this, what we'd call astronaut food that was dropped at night and hydrate it, which Moses taught them how to do it. And then they became even more subservient and grateful to him, as they thought they were going to starve the second day out in the desert. And he showed them how to rehydrate the dry food. There's more to the story because Pharaoh was not going to let them go. This is a very famous piece of information. It's called the 10 Plagues of Egypt. These plagues had to happen pretty much one after the other for the story to make sense. But again, if you read the Bible, you won't know they happened one after the other. It doesn't say they didn't. It just says, oh, Pharaoh said, you can go, because there had been a plague of locusts. And then Pharaoh changed his mind because he needed them to build his city, which would be his capital city, the Central American Pharaoh. That's Punt, P-U-N-T. And if you reduce the letters to the consonants, which is what you do, you remove the vowel just because they can't carve everything in stone. And if you know it's a proper name, you'll figure out P-N-T is Punt or Punt. In that case, you'd have to find a Punt, a real Punt. And because Hatshepsut was a priestess of Isis, and Isis was formed by one of the Masters, that's the original Isis, the Osiris and Isis cult, as a defense against the reptilian activities in Egypt. It was a secret organization. They had their own priests, had underground ceremonies, safe places. And Hatshepsut was a double agent. She was an agent of love and an Isis priest, a priestess, and she was a pharaoh. So she had all the information because the pharaohs represented the gods, and the gods were some of them, especially the crocodile. And the crocodile was always active. Gods were out to scorch the humans and destroy the entire race. Once they had everything's going smoothly. Because it was successful, that brings us to the present time. Almost everybody in the world carries the Abraham gene. It was a favorable gene, and that's how properties get spread. The better qualities somehow propagate, and the other qualities don't. So there's an attractiveness to people with a better genetics. And so they attract each other, they marry, and they have children. And that's how it's spread. It's all through the world. By the Hebrew army capturing other tribes and killing the men so that they could impregnate the women. So it was a violent thing. And they had to do that in Africa, even among the black tribes that were being enslaved. They had to kill the men in many cases and then impregnate the women or become friendly with the women. They could stay there. There's so many, 600,000 altogether. Moses left 2 tribes of Israel in Africa when he went over to put an end to kill all the slave outfit, and not their women, but impregnate their women. Now, here we are in the world today. We all carry the Abraham gene, or anybody listening. And because it's not only in South America, but the Hebrew people came back into in 600 BC. So for the last 2,600 years, the Jewish quality has spread in most people. It's just a small percentage, but it's enough to prevent it from being palatable by reptoid aliens. That's how the world stood maybe 50 or 100 years ago, when we had freedom and we had real progress. Now, on one hand, that's the Ekmasters couldn't protect humans because the aliens would have invaded, but the alien reptoids caught on, and so they developed a plan to reverse it and make the human DNA edible at this time by eliminating everybody who doesn't have reptilian DNA. So that's the process we're watching. And though they do it, one of the things I found out just recently, the PCR test that will tell them what your DNA is at the same time that it installs the graphene oxide and the rest of it. So they'll know who you are. And if they find that your DNA is acceptable to them, they'll have your name and address. So they don't have to get rid of everybody. They have to be selective. That's the current state of it. That's what's going on right now. As far as the good news, that I'll save it for another time, because it's also shocking and quite difficult. We'll show you pictures of the large ships now. Pharaoh's ship, just as you saw the reed boat of the Norwegian explorer that crossed the ocean successfully in 1971. And then he built another reed boat, and it went from Abraham's domain around Africa. But Abraham never sailed around Africa. Hebrews never, because Abraham is the father of the Hebrews, and Pharaoh sent him on a proper, safe boat with his army to cross over, and then they all developed a new homeland, or their first homeland. If you know the Bible at all, Abraham had a very strange fatherhood. He was 90 years old, his wife was 70. They never expected to have a child. And what he thought was God, but is Jehovah, informed him that he would have a child, and he didn't really believe it. But there in South America, they did have, and they called him Isaac. And then the line of Hebrews and Jews starts. Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau. And you find, for example, that Ben Esauela has Esau in the name. That's a nice example. Ben Esauela, Esau. But Ben is Ben, it's the son of Ben Esau, son of Esau, or sons of Esau. Esau gets the raw deal. His brother Jacob, twin brother, steals the blessing from his father, and the next generation is named Jacob. Yes, and Jacob. Hold on there. Let me get that right. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Esau. Jacob then has 12 sons. These become the 12 tribes of Israel. And again, people know the story of Joseph and the dream coat, or have seen the show, Joseph and the Technicolor Dream Coat by Andrew Weber, when he was still a student, a high school student. Good show, short. And they go to, Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt by his brothers. But he interprets Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh takes a shine to him. He becomes Pharaoh's advisor. He warns him that a shortage of food is coming in 7 years. They store up for 7 years, and they weather the shortage of food, the famine. And altogether, the Hebrews are greatly honored and happy to be invited to live in Egypt. And then these separate tribes locate themselves. But this is not Egypt. This is not Egypt. This is 4 generations into Central America. So they locate themselves all along Central America, down into, mainly into Venezuela, or it wouldn't be called Sons of Esau. Most of the Hebrew colonies are there, and so they're south of Egypt a little bit. But there's another Egypt, the third one, down in Brazil, and where they're doing the DNA work. The Egypt that stretches from Mexico to southern, which is where the PNT city is. The PNT city really hasn't changed its name. It's called Peten, P-E-T-E-N, not Punt. And so Punt is a kind of a hint or a clue. But it is tremendously courageous, a pharaohess at Hatshepsut in 1500 BC. So that program, Nova, picks up the story. Otherwise, we wouldn't know. We couldn't tell. Because she says,
Uh-oh. I think we got
on these ships, or there were dozens of ships and over 2,000 or 3,000 men. But Nova reported all that rather bravely, because all of this has been concealed, and they pretended that's the only Egypt. So here's where I will interrupt the story, and then if we do continue in a week or so, I'll show you more pictures of how, in particular, the reptile goddess controlled the project in South America. So she left her trademarks around Mexico City, not in South America or Central America. So it's a little harder to connect. But when you know everything that happened, it's not hard at all. Most of this I studied and put pieces together, particularly this goes back at least to 1993, when I was reading Sedona magazine, and they had an important teacher out of San Francisco, the lawyer Barbara Brennan, channel what she calls the Viwamas. People generally don't know it, but Viwamas is connected with Sanat Kumara. Some people know who that is. Sanat Kumara, also called Satnam, is the representation of God as close as possible. And any need to reach God has to go through him. Or it doesn't have to, but it can go through him. So I learned from Viwamas that human beings are different, and we have many different galactic races in our genes. We have it because we were an experiment to see if they could stop fighting or make peace attractive to them. And then an accident happened, the unforeseeable event that I've quested for well over 50 years, because I read it in someone named Gurdjieff. He said, no one can be blamed. It's an unforeseeable event. Don't blame God. Don't blame the masters. No one could know this was going to happen, to make the human DNA susceptible to interest and justifiable interest in reptilians. Humanoids is a different race from the reptoid race and was created later. The reptoid race, with some justification, says, well, we're first, we were on Earth first, and we're not letting another race tell us what to do in this physical dimension. So next time we'll talk about where the spaceships fly, the astral plane, and why some people can see it, where the collection of the DNA takes place, and it's well known in, say, in Mexico and further south, the ships come and go all the time. And these are not basically friendly ships. They're coming for the same business as before, but of course much less, because Abraham was able to stop it. Moses, we were able to stop it with great cost and sacrifice of life. The Hebrew people dedicated themselves for over 1,000 years to rescue humanity from this plague, but it was always going to be temporary.
Okay, we're going to end it there if we
Yep.
can.
That's it.
I want to thank you, Larry, for everything that you've been doing. I know not just back with your international law background, but also with your Army and Navy. He's a full lieutenant, as well as in the Army. So I want to thank you, Radhaa, for joining us and for putting this all together and coordinating it. We're very grateful. And if someone does need to get a hold of us, we'll be monitoring the comments. And if they do need to get a hold of me for questions, to forward to Larry, clanmother13@gmail with a K. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Until next time. Bye for
Bye.
now.